Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Charivag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss a module titled Green Revolution Implications for Agrarian Structure 2. In this module, it's part of the larger paper called Agrarian Social Structure and Change. This module is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur, IIM Kolkata. In this module, we will look into the implications of green revolution leading to a widening of a gap between small and big farmers. We will also look into how rural inequality has increased using the case study of Bulandshahr. Further, the impact of green revolution is also seen in increasing rural poverty as green revolution emphasizes capital intensive farming. Widening gap between small and large farmers. The Green Revolution gave rise to several myths which were busted in the long run, as evidence from different regions would corroborate. The Green Revolution was considered to be ideologically stable for the big farmers because it was capital intensive and machinery driven. It was expected that the big farmers would be able to afford the total package of necessary inputs such as modern agricultural implements like tractors, tillers, irrigation, pump sets, chemical fertilizers, pesticides and insecticides. Alongside, there was also an understanding that overall yield rate as well as agricultural productivity per acre was positively correlated to farm size. This idea was proved wrong by a survey undertaken by Bhalla and Chadda across 180 villages in Punjab. The survey in Punjab found that small and marginal farmers did not lack initiative or interest. Though competition with the big farmers was an uphill task, they were ready to take the risk. They were willing to try out all possible measures to improve their farm inputs. Small and marginal farmers in Punjab adjusted their cropping patterns in response to the opportunities available to them. Bhalla and Chadda found that all the crops were grown in the farms of all sizes. The only difference was in the percentage of cropped area under individual crop. Despite the dependence on traditional capital inputs, small farms supplemented their own stock of productive assets by hiring machine services, the cost of which was much higher on small and marginal farms than on large farms. As far as productivity is concerned, Bhalla and Chadda's survey shows that the agricultural income per acre in the case of smallest of the farms was rupees 754.50 per acre, while it was 740 per acre for the largest ones. Thus, in matters of farm size, agriculture productivity, adoption of green revolution technology, investments in agriculture, the marginal and small farmers stand close to the medium and large ones, mainly on the strength of their equally strong irrigation base. The researchers also agree that this situation might be a peculiar feature of Punjab agriculture and may not have its counterpart in most areas outside Punjab. The only difference between these two categories of farmers was regarding paddy cultivation, where the small farmers tried to counterbalance the relative disadvantage of lower overall yields by achieving higher cropping intensity and more intensive employment of their family labor. The Green Revolution technology was considered to be scale neutral in character. This meant that irrespective of the size of the farm, the technological intervention of the Green Revolution, whether it is high yield variety seeds, lift irrigation, mechanization of irrigation or farm subsidies, would benefit the small farmers and the big landowners alike. But the implementation of Green Revolution was a lot influenced by the bureaucracy and the officials who were responsible for disseminating information about the techniques of cultivation and possible gains from the introduction of new technology. It was found that agricultural development bureaucracy at the local level had a different perception. The Agrarian mentions that their understanding rarely conformed to the notion of scale neutrality, and their actions almost always reflected a tactic pro-rich policy of rural development. John Mencher, 1978, for example, found that most of the agricultural officers whom she had interviewed in Tamil Nadu thought that small farmers could be ignored in the course of Green Revolution. This was because they had small uneconomic holdings and hardly made a substantial contribution to production. The big landowners, on the other hand, could be taken along as they were well off, had big farms, and thus could be expected to contribute to agricultural production in a big way. However, Mencher found that small farmers were as innovative and were equally keen to adopt new methods of farming which would lead to increased yields, but they often lacked resources that would enable them to experiment with new methods, nor did they have the support of the agricultural bureaucracy. Another instance where the unfavorable attitude of the bureaucracy towards small farmers was made evident when an analysis of electricity connections was made, which indicated that the needs of the rich farmers were catered to systematically by the Punjab State Electricity Board. It is documented that during the time of Green Revolution, the State Electricity Board would charge 10,000 rupees per connection given on a priority basis for agricultural purposes. This came down to 7,000 rupees, which was said to be equivalent to the average annual income which could be generated by farmers whose average land size was about 1.74 hectares. It was also the bare minimum maintenance requirement for a family of 6 sustaining themselves on this land. This practice seems to have stopped eventually, but clearly indicates that such a policy could have benefited the big farmer. The small and marginal farmers are at a disadvantage because very few can afford to incur expenditure on electricity connection and diesel, a fact which was corroborated by the study undertaken by Bhalla and others. Thus, Green Revolution technology may be scale neutral, but it was far from being resource neutral. Small farmers also experience disadvantage when they are tied to networks of dependence with big farmers of the region, as Bulandshahr city cited later by Barker and Jewett would show that as tenant cultivators they are dependent on the big farmers for access to water and fertilizers for their crop. It was invariably the small and marginal farmers who were the poorest in the region, as they had no access to irrigation facilities and were hence dependent upon the farmers who had tube wells or bore wells in their land. Similarly, access to proper fertilizers was also dependent on what these big farmers gave them. As the quality of fertilizers and access to water was compromised, agricultural productivity in the lands also suffered. One of the most important reasons which made the Green Revolution successful was in Western UP and parts of Haryana was the presence and active mobilization by the Bharatiya Kisan Union. According to Barker and Jewett, the government investment in agriculture development was to a large extent driven by the growing strength of the rural lobby. When the government tried to reduce subsidies on agricultural inputs like fertilizer and fuel, there were loud protests in the 1970s and 1980s from the new farmers movement in the region. The dominant members of the rural society who were members of the BKU ensured that the benefits of the new agricultural technology were directed towards serving their own interests. In fact, it is said that the strength of the farming lobby played a significant part in determining who the beneficiaries of the Green Revolution technology were. Evidence from Bulandshahr, Western UP, a case study. A survey of the impact of the Green Revolution technology in certain villages of Bulandshahr district in Western Uttar Pradesh 35 years after technology was introduced in the area yielded very interesting results. The primary reason attributed to an increase in the quality of life in the villages studied was the adoption of Green Revolution technology, especially the high-yielding variety seeds, particularly wheat, adopted in the 1960s, which had helped tide over the threat of famine. Subsequently, the adoption of new technology in the region also ensured wealth and prosperity. Both men and women of the area were certain that most of the improvements were directly or indirectly linked to the Green Revolution technology. For example, the perception was that improvements in rural electrification was introduced keeping the irrigation of high-yielding variety in mind. Similarly, they also believed that education had become affordable due to the profit derived from cultivating high-yielding varieties. People in the area were worried that livelihood security that had been brought by Green Revolution would be lost if plantation growth was not checked, as crop production had reached a plateau. The researchers found that people's outlook had undergone a change since 1972 when the first round of fieldwork had been undertaken. The rigidity of caste and gender hierarchies had also declined a little, evident in the participation of people of different caste in the survey. Now the researchers recognize that all the material improvements cannot be linked to the adoption of the Green Revolution technology. They also found that the area had developed as the process of rural electrification was complete. A sustained program of research and development in crop technology had been initiated by the state. Irrigation, fertilizers, seeds, farm machinery, insecticides and pesticides were easily available. There was the presence of an efficient marketing structure. Animal breeding centers had also developed alongside plant breeding mechanisms, etc., and these were in some way or the other linked to Green Revolution. Patterns of land ownership changed significantly over the past 30 years. Earlier in the villages studied, power laid in the hands of the higher caste Hindu farmers, Brahmins and Rajputs in some village and wealthy Muslims. These powerful farmers also had the largest land holdings. Fieldwork revealed that over the past 30 years, many of the dominant Hindus, particularly the Rajputs and the Jats, had sold off their land after profiting them from Green Revolution and moved to the urban areas. Their land had not been absorbed by the farmers who were left behind due to sealing. land ceiling laws. Instead, the land had been acquired by Muslims and other lower castes such as Jatavs and Balmiki or Chamas, who were now numerically dominant among the Hindu farmers in the area. Fieldworks suggest that absence of increased concentration of the lands in the hands of the richest. This was a significant change. Although after 2000 the number of landholders in the villages studied had increased, most influential members were still the wealthy Muslims and few remaining Brahmin, Rajput and Jat families. In fact, concern among wealthy villagers seemed to be rooted primarily in resentment over the recent distribution of small land parcels from the rich to poor households under the government Skills Like Ambedkar program initiated by Mayawati government. Though it was not clear whether access to land had improved the social condition. An increase in the population of the poorer Hindus and the Muslims necessitated the survival of these poor people irrespective of whether they were Hindus or Muslims, now dependent on supplementing subsistence production from earnings from off-farm and non-farm employment by as many family members as possible. Land reform program of the government had distributed some excess land in the region to the lower caste and the poor. But the landowning caste had ways of holding land beyond the ceiling limit. While the large farmers primarily grew a combination of wheat and sugarcane, the small farmers predominantly grew wheat and rice, which were used for consumption. Cash income for small farmers was largely obtained from selling the labor rather than the crops. Benefits accruing to large farmers were more than that of accruing to the small farmers. From the use of two key inputs of water and inorganic fertilizer, it is evident that small farmers are at disadvantage in the production of high-yielding variety compared with their larger counterparts. Though the availability of irrigation water might have increased, the benefits are not evenly spread. Irrigation water is more expensive for the poor than for the rich. Tube well water is more expensive than canal water in spite of subsidy on electricity. This is a major burden for small farmers, especially where the land is distant from canals and where they have no option but to depend on the tube well for irrigation of their high-yielding variety. The government does offer some help with the cost of the tube well installation, but if the initial subsidized tube does not function properly for any reason, the farmers are given no further help. Farmers having no access to canal water or not owning pump sets had to depend on the tube wells owned by the other farmers. Such farmers were invariably the smallest, poorest ones. They generally went for less than optimal quantities of irrigation water than their crops given the cost involved. Thus, they harvested lower yields than those who had access to their own pump sets and tube wells and or to the canal water. Similarly, as far as use of fertilizer is concerned, small farmers with less than 3 acres of land and many with less than 1 acre mostly opt in fertilizers from the richer farm neighbors, usually in exchange for work. Good quality of fertilizer was thus not guaranteed, and the small farmers had little choice but to accept whatever fertilizer was given to them by the large farmers. Most used only one type of fertilizer, NNP, regardless of whether or not it was appropriate for the soil. This almost certainly contributed to the relatively low yields they harvested in comparison with the larger farmers. These were the same farmers who were unable to apply sufficient irrigation water to their crop. Resolving the stagnation in crop yields in the face of a rapidly growing population thus represents a major challenge to the farmers in the Doab and the much of India in the future. There is scope for planting green manures and also for applying animal dung to the fields, but during the dry months virtually all dung produced in the villages is mixed with chaff by women and made into dung cakes, fried and dried and used as fuel. This constitutes an important source of income for women, and hence there is a little reluctance to use it in their own fields, which might lead to higher crop yields and sustainability of agriculture. Most of the small farmers were also unable to afford seed of good quality and depended on larger farmers for their supplies. They often paid for the supplies they received with their labor. They had little control over the quality of the seed they received or the price they paid for it. Furthermore, rarely were these the newest and the most high-yielding varieties. Usually, the small farmers were not perceived as credit-worthy by the banks, so they had to pay high levels of interest to richer neighbors in the village in order to borrow money. Again, the means of repaying debts was through their own labor, which frequently left them short of time on their old fields. For these and many other reasons, the gap between the large and the small farmers had widened over the past 30 years. Though the researchers were frequently minded, no one in the villages went hungry anymore. According to an estimate provided by the researchers, small farmers owned some 40% of the village wealth in 1972, but they hold only 20% now. Landless were still the poorest as a group, but while they owned virtually nothing in 1972, they now possess allegedly 10 to 15% of the wealth of the village. Further, the growth of Bulandshahr had stimulated the non-farm economy and had seen a demand for labor rise. As a consequence, employment opportunities for both men and women had increased, as had the wage rates. Benefits accruing from Green Revolution have been experienced by only a small proportion of the growing number of landless people. Most continue their existence in poverty. The material assets of the Balmikis were meager in comparison to the high caste neighbors. That was repeatedly claimed that no one went to bed hungry. Rich farmers are considered to be more creditworthy than the small and marginal farmers. In a micro-level longitudinal study of two villages from Mandya district in Karnataka, conducted at two different points of time in 1955 and 1970, Kalat Epstein found that as irrigation facilities were extended to two different villages, holdings per acre of the upper caste Lingayat steadily increased, where the percentage of land belonging to the lower untouchable scheduled caste Adi Karnataka decreased. Wetlands also attracted investors from outside who were interested in investing the capital in land. Epstein found that the rural credit societies in the region were monopolized by the rich farmers who controlled cooperative institutions not for symbolic gains of status but to serve the vested interest. The rich farmers could easily get loans from cooperative societies at an official rate, which was half the rate of what private money lenders charged. Hence, they were in a much better position to buy large quantities of fertilizer on credit and thereby ensure good harvest than poorer farmers. The Green Revolution technological breakthrough was made possible in a few crops: wheat, rice, maize, and so on. The narrow genetic base of the high-yielding variety was not only gradually reduced, world food diversity also made the crops vulnerable to pests and diseases. Imbalanced and improper use had not only affected agricultural yields, but it also created problems of toxicity. The growth of acreage under the high-yielding variety is often at the cost of other food crops, particularly pulses in India. Another tendency mentioned by Jodhka concerns increasing rural inequalities, which were bound to affect mass nutrition in the long run. Changes in the production relations, that is, weakening of the employer-employee ties, substitution of cash for kind as far as wages are concerned, as byproducts of Green Revolution adversely affect food grain consumption of some categories of the poor. With the commerce getting precedence over nutrition, gap between production and mass consumption may further widen. The important policy implication is that distribution of productivity gains of high-yielding varieties is as important as the growth of yields, because the problem of nutrition is not of production but of distribution. Bhalla Chadda's study found that Green Revolution had indeed brought prosperity to the peasantry in Punjab. Due to the creation and availability of an irrigation base, all categories of cultivators who had adopted Green Revolution technology were able to improve their productivity and income substantially. But the gains of the new technology were found to be distributed more or less in proportion to the initial landholdings position. Since landholdings were distributed in skewed manner, the distribution of gains have been quite inequitable. In the plains of central Punjab, it has been seen that the small and marginal farmers are unable to produce as much per capita because of their land base. They have to engage themselves in a number of non-farm activities in order to obtain a higher per capita earning. Unfortunately, in spite of putting in a very hard labor in both farm and non-farm related activities, quite a few of them are not able to save themselves from the clutches of poverty. It has been disquieting realization that even in the heartland of Green Revolution, about one-third of the marginal farmers, that is cultivating up to 2.5 acres, and one-fourth of the small farmers cultivating from 2.5 to 5 acres, and one-fifth of the medium-level farmers cultivating up to 7.5 acres live below the poverty line. The Green Revolution as a poverty alleviating measure has not been quite successful. In fact, according to Dhanagre, all available statistics reflect greater immiserization and pauperization as a Green Revolution technology package spread in different parts of the country. In the period between 1960, 61, 67, 68, according to an estimate, the proportion of rural people living below poverty line has increased massively. In the heartland of Green Revolution, the proportion of rural poor has quadrupled. Another study sponsored by ILO, which drew a sample from 4 different states, namely Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Bihar, UP, revealed that distribution of income has become worse and real incomes of rural poor had declined. In the rich farmlands of Punjab, where the real income had grown by almost 26%, which was fastest in India, the proportion of poor living below poverty line grew from 18% in 1960 to 23% in 1970. This was true for Tamil Nadu as well, where the percentage of population living below the basic minimum also grew from 36.04% in 1961-62 to 48% in 1969-70. As ILO study revealed, the social origins of rural poor was that they primarily consisted of agricultural laborers, landless or near landless families. The primary thrust of Green Revolution was productivity and growth. The assumption that this growth in itself would be sufficient as it would percolate down to the poor and solve the problems of rural poverty in India. But this does not happen in the way it was imagined. Where there has been a political will and a commitment to distributive justice, agricultural growth had made little difference, as in the case study of Bulandshahr mentioned above. But largely in rural areas, we witness consolidation of class interest as a result of Green Revolution. It has made a class of kulak a political force to reckon with. Growth and poverty alleviation need not necessarily be treated as separate goals. In fact, experience of Green Revolution tells us that rural inequalities can be reduced only when concerns of growth, distribution and social justice are factored together in the programs of development. In conclusion to the module titled Green Revolution, implications in terms of the agrarian structure, we need to understand how, due to the policies of Green Revolution that kind of was based on high technology and capital intensive kind of farming, it has increased rural inequality and rural vulnerability. We also need to interlink the growth, distribution and social justice, especially in the context of Green Revolution that has led to the marginalization of large number of rural poor. Further, because it has increased rural inequalities and rural poverty, we also need to rethink about how we can re-understand the agricultural strategy for a country like India that is agrarian based. Therefore, this module has given us lot of pointers to think about how to understand Green Revolution, especially in terms of contrasting demands, whether do we need food security more or do we need to address the structural concerns, especially in terms of rural poverty. Thank you.